Mr. President, another issue I've been coming down to talk about on the Senate floor for the past couple years is an issue that I don't think we focus on enough here in the Congress, here in the Senate, and that's the key issue of economic growth, American economic growth. With the exception of national security, strong, robust economic growth is probably the most important issue we can be focused on in this body. We certainly have many challenges in this country, but so many of them are made easier when the American economy is strong, when job opportunities are plentiful, and optimism in the future because of that strong economic growth is high. So, how have we been doing? How have we been doing over the past decade? Well, I want everybody to take a look at this chart. The answer is not very well. Not very well at all. So this chart right here shows the gross domestic product, GDP, decade after decade, through different administrations, Democrat and Republican, over the last several decades. So if you take a look here, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Clinton, Bush 41 and 43, and President Obama, you see where levels have been. You see that over the years, over the decades, the average economic growth is about right here, about 4%. 4%. You know, there's been a lot of talk about what has made America great, what makes America great. This is what makes America great. Strong, robust economic growth, decade after decade. That's the key. So what happened over the past decade? Right here. Mr. President, you take a look here. Right here, this red line, that's 3%. That's not the traditional levels. Traditional levels over 200 plus years of American history is closer to 4%. But 3% GDP growth is considered okay. Not bad, not great, but pretty good. Pretty good. Something that we should all aspire to, something that we should hit. Well, if you look at this chart, in the last decade, never hit it. Not even 3% GDP growth. More like 1.5%, 2%. As a matter of fact, President Obama was the first president in American history who never hit 3% GDP growth for a year. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This seems to be a pretty important issue, right? Economic growth, last decade, not even hitting 3%. How come the press wasn't writing about that? You didn't hear many stories in the press about this. Really important issue. A decade of lost economic growth. And yet, many of us come down here, talk about this critical issue, and there's a yawn in the press gallery. No interest. Hard to understand why. One theory I have, if you look at our country more broadly, these are the numbers. Very, very weak growth. But certain places of the country over the last 10 years have actually done really well. Like especially this city, Washington, D.C., growing real strong, probably 5-6% growth. Some other places, some of the coastal big cities, New York, San Francisco, Boston, all doing well, way higher than 3%, growing strongly. So the press, in my view, is probably not that interested in this number because in places like Washington, everything seemed to be going great. But it wasn't going great. Think about this. If Washington or LA or New York or San Francisco are growing at 3 or 4% growth, and yet the country's at about 1.5 or 2, then there's probably huge parts of America that are actually shrinking, not growing at all. And that's a problem. Now, Mr. President, these charts, they talk about economic growth, GDP, can sound a little bit wonky. But really, GDP is a marker for the health of our economy. It's an indicator of American progress. It's a proxy for the American dream and optimism in the future. And as this chart shows, we've had a sick economy over the last 10 years, a lost decade of economic growth. And the press hasn't written much about it, and when they have, they've typically bought the line of the previous administration saying, hey, look, we know that the traditional levels of economic growth are, close to 4%. Boy, look at Clinton, look at Reagan, 4.5%, 5%, 6%. We know that's the case. We know 3% is okay. But the last 10 years, we haven't hit that. So what's wrong? Well, the press started buying the line from the last administration. That's the, quote, new normal. The new normal. We can't hit 3% anymore. We certainly can't hit 4% anymore. 1.5%, 2% is America hitting on all cylinders. Well, I believe that's a surrender. I believe dumbing down our expectations for economic growth is a retreat from the American dream. And as you know, Mr. President, the American people aren't buying this. They're not buying the dumbing down. They're not saying, oh, yeah, we can live with this. 1.5% growth? Sure, no problem. They're wise, and they weren't buying the dumbing down. We all saw the book recently put out by former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And her book was entitled, What Happened? What happened? Mr. President, this is what happened. This is what happened. Our citizens saw the American dream slipping away after a lost decade of economic growth, and they weren't ready to surrender to the new normal. So what do we need to focus on here in the Senate? We have to start moving beyond this. We have to. We need policies that are going to focus on reigniting growth, the growth that Democrats and Republicans have supported for decades. What are those? I think there's a lot of agreement. Infrastructure, less burdensome regulations, energy. America has enormous supplies of energy that we can take advantage of. And yes, the issue we're starting to debate now in the Senate, tax reform. And as we debate this and work in a bipartisan way, because I've heard a lot of my colleagues say, we do need to undertake tax reform. We need to keep asking ourselves on all these policies what it will do to reignite growth, to reignite the American dream, to allow hardworking American families to keep more of their paychecks, and to return the optimism that comes with a robust economy, not just along the coasts of America, but throughout the entire country, and get back to that optimism and growth. So, Mr. President, that's what I'm going to be doing as we undertake this debate on tax reform. The Trump administration is off to an okay start, first quarter. Again, kind of a hangover from the Obama years, 1.2% growth. Not good at all. Last quarter, second quarter, 3.1. Hit above 3%, which is what the president says his policies are meant to do. As long as they're focused on that, I certainly am going to be somebody who wants to support those kind of pro-growth policies. And I think it's imperative, whether it's tax reform, infrastructure, regulatory reform, or energy, that we all come together in this body and make sure and work together so the next decade of growth in America does not look like this lost one. Gets us over 3%, gets us back to traditional levels of growth, Mr. President, I don't think there's anything more important that we can be doing in the Senate than getting back to those important levels of growth for our country and our citizens.